Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought ByteSized RSE, sponsored by the UNIVERSE-HPC program. And for this ByteSized RSE episode, I want to talk about design again, and in particular try to convince you why design matters and why it's important, and that we as researchers and or software engineers should really pay attention to it. Making the case for design and research with me, Meag Doherty from the US and Zihao Lu from the King's Digital Labs of King's College in London, UK. And together we hope to put the capital D into design again. So let's get started. In late 2002, Brian Jeffrey Fogg, a social scientist from the US, published a book with an ominous title, Persuasive Technology. The title caught my attention, alas, not before much later, the mid-2010s to be precise, the moment I started looking into the question how design can help and turn software into meaningful tools, and perhaps be somewhat persuasive too. Of course, 2002 and 2003 was a period of heady days for technology, the days of the first waves of the internet boom, the days when people thought technology could only be used to make our lives better and fairer, the days when technology companies proudly proclaimed to do no evil. But this is 2025 now, and in the meantime we have learned a few lessons regarding some of the applications we use in our daily lives. We learned that apps can be very persuasive and sometimes even manipulative, and not necessarily in a good way. And you don't have to look very far to find examples for how design can manipulate. Take the case of cookies, for example. Cookies, as in the little pieces of code embedded in many, if not most, websites today. They usually collect data about how you interact with the site, which can help developers make their sites better for users. But the data can also be used for passing user details onto a number of companies and organizations without you knowing about it, or knowing what will happen with all the details they collect about you. And so lawmakers introduced legislation that regulates the use of cookies. And for that reason, websites usually pop up a message with details, what data they collect, and give you the option to opt out of at least some of the cookies that are being used. But here's the rub, because the way they do this varies widely. Some make it very clear and give you two simple options: reject all unnecessary cookies or accept all cookies. But then there are some sites that make it a lot harder. You need to scroll through a long and often confusing list where some cookies are enabled while others are not, and therefore it takes a lot longer to process and make a decision. So, what does that have to do with persuasion? Well, generally, the harder it is for a user to go through something, the less likely it is they will use it. And therefore, the way these cookie selections are presented very well influences, or guides, as Brian Fogg would say, users in making choices. Companies who don't want users to disable their cookies might therefore make it more difficult for them to do so. The way users navigate through an app or a website can be used to similar effects, along with other user interface decisions such as highlighting of buttons for default or preferred actions. There are plenty of examples like that in web and mobile applications, and of course in any applications. And of course most of them do this for a very legitimate reason, and they generally want to help users in getting the best out of the software. Why am I going on about this? The bottom line is design matters. And yes, technology can persuade. For good, but sadly also for worse. And this is true not only for commercial apps, but for software and research as well. But sadly, the value and importance of design isn't always appreciated by researchers, and let's be honest, software engineers as well. And during my career, software engineering and design were usually treated quite separately. Rare were the cases where designers worked together with engineers on the same team. In fact, in most cases, design was something that was delivered at the beginning of a software project. We would get the wireframes or whatever form the prototypes were and then deliver to that. And this at a time when software engineering teams started more and more to work in iterative ways. But somehow design always fell outside that. However, things have begun to change, and you can sometimes see designers working quite closely with engineers now. In research and research software engineering, we are also seeing designers being hired and working together with researchers and RSEs. Like, for instance, at King's College in London, and the King's College Digital Lab, or KDL for short, which is where Zihao works as a designer. Zihao has some experience in UX and UI design, as he will explain in the following conversation I had with him.
So hi, I'm Zihao, UX designer currently working at King's Digital Lab, based at KCL, King's College London. So I joined my team in last year, September 2024, and I've been fortunate to work on some fascinating, fun projects. And briefly, I have a background in UI UX design and visual communication design. And I've been kind of doing UX related job and work for several years in both corporate and academic kind of settings. Prior to KDL, I was focusing on designing kind of a more inclusive transportation kiosks, kind of a more inclusive universal user experience for older adults.
That's fantastic, because you've done a number of projects actually from various different perspectives. So is there a project in science or in humanities? I include humanities in science, so I use it as a very general term. But is there a project that you're currently involved with or recently have been involved with that you can talk about? Describe what your role there was as a UX designer and what it was about.
I can briefly introduce my work in the KDL now, like King's Digital Lab. Basically, unlike, let's say, traditional design agencies, the project here is very quote unquote niche. Like we have very various, diverse theme of projects. It can be a challenge for designer or developers to learn for each project, but I feel like I really enjoy this process because I feel like I learn new knowledge, new information about each project. But at the same time, it's I do need to delve in to kind of learn more things. I can shortly, briefly introduce the project I've been working on now. It's called Crossread B. Basically, the aim was to design a digital corpus or digital library platform about the ancient Sicilian inscriptions, which is kind of stone tablets. And it kind of aims to provide free, open, accessible data to, let's say, academic and public users, museum and university students, even lecturers, etc. So it was started fairly early on, around 2017, with already more than 4,500 inscriptions documented already. But it was I want to borrow a film. It's everything everywhere all at once. So it's you see all the data everywhere together, and you can see that researchers are very urged and keen to share the knowledge and data to all the users. I understand that because when you research something, when you're passionate about it, you think everything's important. You think, okay, they need to read this and that. But sometimes it might be not that accessible. So I think this is where we UX designers came in handy. I was actually joining this halfway, but still we were facing the same problem as the previous designer. When I looked at the original site, I got this vibe of it's basically everywhere about piece of key information, but it's not very kind of combined together good enough. Okay, so if you want to share all the data, let's help you to make a hierarchy. Yeah, I understand you want to show everything, but it doesn't apply to users, especially you have very wide, diverse range of audiences, not only targeting academic organizations. But also, I want to say, thank for the previous designers. They did such a great user research job. They did evaluate research, concept testing, contextual inquiry, even and desirability studies, which is very helpful for me to get even deeper insight about this project. And it's too long to talk about the whole project, so I can elaborate one issue I was trying to address. Actually, the view of each inscription page, like translation metadata display of the stone tablets, there are many extra steps before you get into that. And there's no direct or distinct button to kind of to lead me to that page. I wouldn't know which to click to view that. So instead of just already there's just a table view, or full the metadata,
Mm.
we decided to improve the presentation mode as card presentation. For example, like each card showcase no more than 5 key data, so kind of limited what you can see already. And we're highlighting what is most important, which is a stone tablet, which is they actually dig out from the dirt.
Right.
So yeah, wow, that's amazing, impressive. So I want to click into that and learn more about that. So basically, the researchers know where to find because they know the ID, and also the normal that public users knows, okay, I'm intrigued to in this image and I want to know more about this page.
Because we do have different audiences, as you say. So the researcher expects to see maybe more details than, say, a member of the public who is not familiar with it but might be interested in it. So how do you resolve that kind of conflict between different expectations from different audiences?
It's like a really back and forth kind of conversation with the partner, actually. So obviously the partner is mainly research and like a very professional, and they have expectations what they want to show. But I feel like also as a user experience designer, I feel like sometimes I need to stand with my users to kind of like, I wouldn't say against, but also I need to negotiate with my partners. I want to get more, let's say, benefit for my users. So my goal is to make the whole site intuitive for everyone. Then I need to think about, okay, if I want to be intuitive, I need to think less of mostly research and more of the public users. But also I need to take care of the complex data, the presentation. So my negotiation in the end was, so let's say a card. I want to emphasize highlighting the image, making it big and bigger. Just imagine like let's say a fashion design website. I want them to treat it as like a product, quote unquote, to say, to kind of make it more appealing to the user, but also at the same time, making the key, like the metadata in the more like visible places. For example, the ID, which is normal user can't understand, but researcher can, but I'm put it like right above the image. Right. So normally when you see the image, you will already see the ID or the key data already. So I feel like this is kind of when so far the partners would like to go with that.
It started off with a user survey. Did I gather that right?
Yeah, so the user research, because I wasn't part of that, so what I read pile of document, which is a lot. I liked it, but also it was like, wow, it's really a lot to read. I took like almost a week to read all the document. But yeah, it was started with a survey, but kind of like a mixed method research. They start from a quantitative survey with the internal, let's say, the partner side and also our KDL side as well. Like we both took part in. And then we kind of moved to qualitative study, like some usability testing.
I think the usability testing is something that interests me a little bit more because there are various different ways in which you can do usability testing. You can have a prototype. I think there are some apps that use some kind of sketches. They're actually not full-size websites, but they're kind of graphical representations. But I think nowadays you have tools where you can quickly prototype and show what the site actually looks like without having the full implementation, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, what you mean about is like a Figma kind of work. In our term, especially when you refer UI XML, there's mainly 3 different fidelities of, let's say, prototypes. It was started by low fidelity, which is mainly wireframing. And then now we're more from mid fidelity to high fidelity, which is like included interaction as well, but not as implemented like complex interaction. We're more like Figma wise, like especially my part. So in this case, it's really unlikely to asking users, let's say, to use the Figma to do the usability testing because none of them are designers, and it's unfair to ask them to learn a new tool just for this workshop. For my previous experience, in this case, and normally I would draw on my own prototype. For example, I would draw, let's say, a pile of A4 paper, like each paper represented a different interface. So I would just like ask them to use the paper as, just imagine as the computer interface and ask them to like draw or to click everything. And then if they decided to click this button to direct to another page, just go through a different paper. And then I was sitting beside them to observe them. It's like one of my usability testing. But this is more like a mid fidelity. But now maybe right next move is the high fidelity, which is after the full implementation before the publication. In that case, it's more like the whole awesome to try the URL, the website, the web page, and get like a fully or final feedback about it.
There is also something called A and B testing. Yeah, you have basically 2 versions of the site, which are slightly different if you want to test. Is that something that you used in your work previously?
Not for this one. In the beginning, normally it starts with that. Even sometimes A, B, and C, which is very B. So especially when I was freelancing as a designer, I normally start with, let's say, 3 directions. In that case, I would say, I would give my clients normally and ask them to kind of try out with either internally, externally, if they have the resource. Or sometimes I would, most of the time actually, I would join as an external, as a designer, to help with the workshop if they're holding one.
So how do you manage the interactions with the clients? Let's call them clients, and that could be the primary investigator or the research team. So how does this interaction work? So in your current position at KDL?
For example, for the cross-read, the background is like our KDL project is very collaborative process. Mostly internally also work with the researcher and developers. First of the step is, for example, I have this interaction in my mind and I try to do it in Figma, which is compared with the coding is more limited kind of with the interaction. So I try to also write down the design description and also a little presentation about that and then show it to my teammates, developer. And then I would get the feedback if they implement it. And if they can, if this is okay, and then maybe we should show 1, 2, 3 or 1 or 2 to the clients and let them choose which interaction is more user-friendly and secondly, go with their goal as well. So I don't know if that makes sense. Like with step 1 and step 2, like internal first and then external.
So you kind of iterate internally. So first of all, you see, and then, okay, this is ready now, and I want to present this to the users. And then we go through a number of iterations.
It will be a bit impossible. If I design interaction, but then the developer cannot make it implement it and then already show it to the clients, that is kind of awkward situation.
How does this intersect then with the software development cycle? So people have it in their mind. Let's put it this way. People have it in their mind that designers come in at the beginning. They deliver their beautiful designs and then the software developers do their thing, and then the work of the designer is done. Is that how it works in your case, or are you accompanying them throughout the project?
I would say a lot of designers are not even come early enough. So in different cases, from my previous experience as well, people would think, designers, what you need to do is make it pretty. From my point of view, designers should be in the project life cycle from the beginning to the end. Because design is not only about making a section, because we need to have a whole overview of the project so we can deliver a better user experience. Because user experience is a cohesive experience. It's not like from 1 to B and then B to C is, developer can deal with that. It's not like that. Designer can take care of the whole experience. And with that, we need to start from the beginning of the project and to the end of the project. And we need to, it's like design is an iterative process. In summary, it's I believe designers should go along with all the time and then should participate all the, let's say, iterative process.
As you can see, Zihao is working closely with engineers and that he tries to make design work as an integral part of the development cycle. There are also some interesting techniques he mentioned, like a 3-tiered system of approaching design. First, a raw and high-level draft, sometimes called a wireframe, then Tier 2, which consists of a partial implementation of the site before Tier 3, which is the full thing. There are tools available for each of these steps. For wireframing, we have tools like Figma, as Zihao mentioned, but also perhaps tools that are equally well known like, for instance, Balsamiq, and you'll find the links to them in the show notes. But often, as he mentioned, good old-fashioned paper will do the trick just as well. The important thing at all of these various decision levels is to get feedback from developers and, if possible, end users. And this can be done in surveys and questionnaires, during workshops, or as Meag will tell us later, in so-called hallway testing. The trick is really to get feedback at each of the development and design stages. In short, this way of developing design is really no different to the iterative way in which software engineers deliver their applications and software products. Design is not only important at the project and implementation level, it also plays an important role for organizations as a whole. In organizations, this is often done through so-called product manager or sometimes business analysts. Strangely, they also have a hard time to get heard by decision makers and implementers at times, Which brings me to Meag Doherty, who will talk about it in the conversation I had with her a short while ago. Meg is no stranger to this podcast, and I interviewed her also on user experience design last year. So here's Meg. Okay, hey, Meg, we talked previously, but could you quickly introduce yourself again, please?
Yeah, hi, I'm Meg Doherty. I'm a UX leader, and since we last talked, I began a fellowship in bioethics, and I'm really curious about the intersection between design and bioethics. And I am also a SSI fellow and have spent a lot of time raising awareness about usability practices in scientific software.
Indeed, and we're talking about user experience design and not just user interface design, which we discussed the difference, which we discussed last time. But how is user experience design helping researchers and science projects?
So I think about user experience design. I take the idea one level higher into design, capital D design, and I really
Mm,
think the way is helpful. And I have the six tools or six ideas about what design really does for teams. And I'll just
mm,
read through quickly the six of them. I believe design as a tool for mitigating risk. It's a tool
mhm,
for improving access to science, especially when we're building platforms for science. Design is a tool for accelerating research. So the faster, more efficient our software systems are, the faster we can find discoveries. And then your classic other tools are design as a tool for saving money. If we actually understand users ahead of time, we can save money and rework down the line. And then the last two is a tool for satisfying colleagues. We want to build collegial environments in the spaces that we're building research software. And so by including user needs throughout the process, we're actually satisfying our colleagues. And then
mm.
design also helps us make more deliberative decision making. So if we ask ourselves, what should we build or what should we build next, by engaging with our user base, we actually can slow that process down and make sure that we're really understanding what our investments are.
So, I mean, there are six quite important and interesting points that you made there. So, how do you actually, in practical terms, approach this then in your daily work as a designer? Are there any practical things and concrete steps that you take?
In terms of concrete steps, I think understanding and pitching the value of user experience design, some of the tactical steps is really to understand who your audience is. And I list out six options for the framework so that people can pick and choose based on who they're working with, whether it's a
Mm,
PI or another researcher or a software engineering colleague. The motivations and values are going to differ depending on who you're working with. And so, practically on a day to day basis, I'm always trying to pitch the value of design while doing the design. And that could mean, in some examples, of just really capturing your wins, even if they're small. One example that I always like to use, I previously was a UX designer at Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services here in the US. And
mm,
my colleagues were nurses. And
mm.
I taught nurses about the value of user experience design. And then I'd be in meetings and I would hear them use the phrase. I would hear them talk about design. I would hear them ask questions like, well, what do our users think? And for me, there are those, those small moments are really the day-to-day tactics that help us build better design.
Well, these are the wins, but what about the challenges? Because how hard is it to actually convince people of the value of design?
It is very difficult.
Why?
It is difficult mostly because it can be hard to measure. And
Mm,
people really want, often business leaders, they want to know the quantitative metrics. And we could say that our contributions, increased participation or increased engagement. But when you work in complex settings, where I am at and where you have between 20 and 50 ongoing strategies, it can be really hard to say the one thing that I did moved the needle. We don't have
mm,
that precision like you would in a scientific space. So one thing that to overcome those challenges, one thing that I have my team and myself really work hard on is on the power of narrative and storytelling, and really finding those stories about a researcher who can finally do the analysis that they couldn't do before because we have more no code tools available. Or you have
mm,
a research software engineer who who has learned their first UX design task and they don't need your help anymore. Those are the stories that's why I like to say, try to capture them along the way to kind of build the strong narrative. But it can be really difficult when it's hard to measure your outcomes.
I think that's what business leaders and senior managers certainly want, and primary investigators perhaps too, to some extent. But the developers as well, are they difficult and hard to convince?
I would say less so. I think we're often in the same boat in terms of having constraints put on us, whether it's time,
Mm.
money, deadlines. So yeah, I think we're often in the same boat, and I've had really great experiences collaborating with engineers to come up with creative solutions. One trap early on in my design career was being fixed on the ideal solution. Well, if I can make it in squares and boxes, certainly this can be the final product. But once you get to the real world and start working on some real world applications, you get comfortable with the trade-offs and you get comfortable with the compromises.
Yeah, well, I guess that the trade-off is something we have to learn at some stage, and we
Yeah.
all did.
Yeah.
So how many times did you hear that, oh, that's all very nice design, but we really don't have the time and the budget? So what would you say then?
Yeah, I'm still crafting some of the counter arguments. I'm always refining these counter arguments. I come from the public health sector, and we have a phrase there that an ounce of prevention is a pound of treatment. And I think that is very similar ethos in design, where if we just put a little bit of design up front, we can save a lot of downstream costs. And
Hmm.
yes, it can be challenging to try to get that upfront investment. And the best way I know so far to get that investment is to show, don't tell. So to show the progress from your work, but it's kind of like it's a chicken egg problem because how do you get started? But once you get started, people really feel the clarity that designers can bring to complex workflows. They feel the assurances of, we really understand the user from this context.
Hmm.
And budget and time is a real big constraint. I always just say to just start really small. At the very baseline, we have not as much in-person office experiences anymore, but we have hallway testing, which is to just take your design down your hallway at your institution or wherever you are and get feedback from strangers on your idea. And in scientific software, it's been a little tricky because sometimes the software is very context specific. So it's not like
Yeah.
you can get like, the public to view it. But sometimes I argue maybe you could. Maybe the interface should be so simple that even someone from the sidewalk could understand it.
So at what stage do you think it's best to come in? Is it the beginning? Is it also valuable perhaps to accompany the software developers while they're developing? And how do you approach that? That kind of interaction between the software development team and, the people doing the design.
So my team, where I am right now, we are mostly a UX strategy team. So we work
Hmm.
with the business leaders who are developing program strategy to make sure that the user experience goals match. And so
Right.
my context is enrolling research participants into a research study. And what's interesting about that is we take a lot of time up front to write out the strategy. What are the user goals? How are they coming into this space? And
Hmm.
doing that deep ethnography up front and having that time to make strategy concrete and understandable across the board helps throughout the whole process. So then when we hand off to developers, it's not just a task list, but it's the task
Hmm.
list plus the overarching strategy so that people sometimes the handoff can be large or can be many, but those strategy documents help us stay grounded into what's the real business goal of the whole project.
Final thoughts. You already mentioned start simple, but are there any other tips you could share with the listeners?
Yeah, I think this type of work, talking about strategy and goal setting and metrics, can feel daunting. If you're somebody who is a designer or
Hmm.
engineer, you're much used to like doing the stuff. But I just want to encourage people to try to strive for that higher level thinking and yeah, just practice it. I know when I first wrote my first few problem statements that they were really they were really bad. But once you get used to writing use cases and business problems, you might like it.
I really like the 6 steps Meag used to define the goals of design, especially design for research applications and projects. Design with a capital D, as she says. So let me repeat them again. Design should mitigate risk, enable and improve access to science, accelerate research, help save money, and yes, that's important too, satisfy users but also colleagues, and help us with making sound and more informed decisions. And from Zihao we heard that you get the best out of design when you integrate it with your engineering work. Well, I hope the last few minutes gave you an inkling of what design could do and why it matters. And if nothing else, remember what Meg said earlier. Design is like prevention, and as she says, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of treatment. We've come to the end of this episode now, but before I end it, here are, as per usual, a couple of quiz questions for you. Let's say you're developing an app that monitors patients with a chronic health condition. What kind of risks does this involve, and how do you think design can help to mitigate them? And the second question is, what is A and B testing that was mentioned a little bit earlier, and how can it help with design? Okay, if you like to share your answers, you can contact me on the usual channels like LinkedIn, Mastodon, Blue Sky, Slack, Matrix, or good old-fashioned email, all of which you will find in the show notes. Finally, I'd like to thank Meag and Zihao for their time and contributions and wish them all the best in their endeavors. Thanks for listening and stay tuned. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya.